Okay then. Yeah, so first of all, I would like to welcome all of you for this interesting book discussion series 2025. Uh, Before going to tell about the authors of the book and the discussion of the book, let me first introduce our forum, Speaking from Margin. Speaking from Margin is a student collective and academic platform for research scholars, sociopolitical activists, and students to engage in contemporary discourses on social sciences. We attempt to build academic solidarity for social justice in higher education. This space is dedicated to fostering connecting among researchers from various marginal locations as we engage with the evolving knowledge paradigm of the social sciences. In our collective, researchers from scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, and OBCs, as well as minorities, participate to gain a deeper understanding of research methods, conceptualizations, and theorizations in the diverse field of social sciences. We are honored to have received the support of distinguished speakers who share their insights and strengthen to our initiative. Our past speakers, those who have contributed to these initiatives, are Professor Kancha Ilaya, Rajiv Bhargav, Nivedita Menon, Nandini Sundar, Sudhir Kumar Suthar, Satish Deshpande, Samyavak Chaudhary, Nasreen Chaudhary, Rahul Verma, Meera Chandok, Joya Hassan, N. Sukumar, Maitrey Chaudhary, Urmilesh, Anvita Abbi, Gajala Jamil, Najima Parveen, Sundar Sarukai, Narendra Kumar, Akash Singh Rathore, Rajarshi Dasgupta, Scott Stroud, Ajay Gudavarti, Mahinder Singh, Brahma Prakash, and many others, those who have contributed to. It's a very long list. So, but today we are here to discuss a very fascinating book. The title of the book is Fragile Hope, Seeking Justice for Hate Crimes in India, published in Stanford University Press. But there is also another copy that is published by Navyana. The title of the Navyana publication is The Fragile Life of the Atrocities Act, Seeking Justice Against Caste Crimes. And we are availing this version actually, Navyana publication. So the book is a long ethnographic fieldwork of 18 months in North Indian state of Rajasthan to understand and analyze the everyday life of SC/ST Atrocity Act. I think it's a path-breaking work in the field of caste and law, particularly explaining the social reality of anti-discrimination law in the everyday social life in a broader lens of legal anthropology. As we know, in 2018, the anti-atrocity attitude of our highest court on this law, but due to the force of radical protest that is popularly known as Bharat Bandh, the act remained in its form. But despite this law, we are witnessing in our everyday newsroom the caste atrocities and often come to know how the law is not properly applied and practiced in the ground due to the social performance and positionality of the law enforcement agencies. To understand and know more practical accounts of this act, Sandhya's book is one of the brilliant and serious empathetic engagement. To discuss her book, we are very fortunate to have her with us. Sandhya is an assistant professor of criminology at the University of Bristol. Previously, she was an assistant professor of social anthropology at Vrije University, Amsterdam, and a Leverhulme Early Career Fellow in Anthropology at the University of Edinburgh. She holds a PhD in anthropology from the LSE and MPhil degree in social anthropology from the University of Oxford, and a BA in anthropology and philosophy from Colby College, USA. Sandhya specializes in legal anthropology, and her work explores the relationship between legal institutions, histories, and marginalization, and culturally embedded concepts of truth, violence, hope, and justice in India. Sandhya's first book, entitled this one only, Hope, Fragile Hope, Seeking Justice for Hate Crimes in India, analyzes the social life of India's only crime law, the 1989 Scheduled Castes and Scheduled Tribes Prevention Act. Her recent research explores what historical narratives and temporal models Indian Supreme Court justice and advocates mobilize when evaluating hate speech accusation. Sandhya's research has been published in various of journals such as
Ganesh, we can't hear you.
Ashna is currently Professor of Law at the National Law School of India, University, Bangalore. She teaches legal methods, public international law, and electives design on caste and law. She was a visiting fellow at Humboldt University, Berlin, under the UGC DED-funded Law and Transformation Collaboration, where she worked on the legal dimensions of caste-based discrimination and humiliation. To begin our evening, I would like to warmly invite Sandhya to take us a journey through her book, sharing with us not only its essence, but also her experiences, inspirations, and the motivation behind this remarkable work. She will have about 25 to 30 minutes for this segment, will be the initial one. And following this, we will be joined Dr. Ashna, who will reflect on the book and offer her insightful perspective for around 20 minutes. After that, we'll return to Sandhya, who will respond to Ashna's reflections and enrich the discussion with her thoughts. Finally, we'll open the floor for a lively conversation and interactive session where participants are welcome to engage with Sandhya, share thoughts, and ask questions. This dialogue will flow for about 30 minutes, making it a true celebration of ideas and exchange. Thank you, and now I would like to invite Sandhya for her presentation.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here. And before I start, I just want to make a couple of disclaimers. So first of all, I actually thought it was a little bit longer, the talking portion of this, so I will try to condense this a little bit because I think I had planned it for about 40 minutes. Broadly, what I do want to start with is just by saying there's always a lot of ways of approaching a book talk. And what I thought I would do today is that I try to give you really a sense of the main overarching arguments in Fragile Hope and provide you with a little bit more of a sense of where the Prevention of Atrocities Act actually sits within sort of international hate crime law. And what that means is that I've had to be a little bit selective in kind of the stories and information and arguments that I share. So there are quite a few of arguments, for example, about the role of the police in atrocity cases, but also specifically about sort of the intersectionality of gender-based, patriarchal, and caste-based violence and how that shows up in court cases around the Atrocities Act, that I won't really have time to go into in the talk, but these type of topics constitute a really substantial part of the book, so maybe we can get into that more in the discussion. And the second caveat probably is to say that this is fieldwork. This whole book is based on fieldwork that took place between 2016 and 2018. So that was quite a while ago now, and the political situation, also the situation around funding for human rights NGOs, was different. So we can also, one of the things, if people are curious about this, that we could talk about more later is also to what extent, do the organizations mentioned here and the legal dynamics that are sort of observed around the Atrocities Act at the time that I was doing the field work, to what extent, like what parts of that are still like that today and what parts may have changed. So to start, I'm going to share with you an ethnographic vignette, a short anecdote from the book, from the start of the book. And just as a trigger warning, it's a little bit hard to hear, so you just be prepared. So on a foggy morning in 2017, I sat in Auntie G's living room in Jaipur, in the capital of Rajasthan, and I watched her concentrate on some intricate stitching work. Suddenly, Auntie G put down her needles. "Look at this," she demanded forcefully, showing me a delicate yellow flower. I haven't made anything so beautiful or bright in a long time because I'd lost all hope. But I have a little bit of hope again now. Raghu's legal case is difficult because the legal system is so stacked against people like us. But I feel like at least we have a way to fight now. I was unsure how to respond. The pain of losing her youngest son, Raghu, was still raw for Auntie G, and her hope in legal victory so fragile. A year earlier, in January 2016, Raghu, a promising young doctor, had committed suicide after being kidnapped and tortured by 5 men of the Brahmin caste. Auntie G and her family belonged to the Meghwal community, one of the most numerically and economically robust Dalit tabkas in Rajasthan. The family was upwardly mobile, educated, and financially secure. They lived a comfortable urban life in Jaipur, and Auntie Ji and her husband had considered caste-based discrimination and violence something which wouldn't affect middle-class families like their own. However, Raghu's tragic fate had taught them that their caste status still mattered much more than they had previously believed. At university, Raghu had fallen in love with a Brahmin girl called Karishma. But when Karishma's family found out about the union and the relationship, they banished her, and the couple married in secret. Karishma's family announced that they would have accepted anyone as a son-in-law, but not a Meghwal. So Karishma came to live with Auntie Ji and her new husband in Jaipur, but she always heavily grieved the loss of her own natal family. A year after the wedding, when Karishma was pregnant, things seemed to take a fortuitous turn. Her family contacted the couple and requested that they visit them in Delhi. So Raghu and Karishma promptly traveled up and walked directly into a trap. As soon as they got out of the car in front of Karishma's parents' home, her four brothers and father overwhelmed Raghu. They beat him violently, they cursed and insulted him, and subsequently tied him up and tossed him in a nali in a sewage canal. Raghu somehow managed to escape and find a shop with a telephone landline to call his father, who rushed up from Jaipur to get him medical attention and bring him home. But when Raghu later called Karishma from his father's phone, she didn't pick up. Later, he received a text message from her. Karishma said she wanted a divorce. She wrote that marrying Raghu was the biggest regret of her life. After that, Raghu seemed broken. His parents no longer recognized him. Their charismatic youngest son had become withdrawn, weeping for his lost love and child. Only a few days after his return home, Raghu walked out of his family home early in the morning and headed towards the railway tracks south of his neighborhood. There he threw himself in front of a train. He left behind a letter for his brother explaining that, abandoned by his wife and humiliated for his status as a Dalit, he no longer wanted to live. For Auntie Ji and her family, Raghu's death was not suicide. It was murder, a death forced upon their son by the irreparable trauma of caste discrimination, hate, and social rejection. And so Auntie Ji and Uncle Ji decided to call on the only ally they could think of at the time, the 1989 Scheduled Caste, Scheduled Tribes Prevention of Atrocities Act. Auntie Ji knew that the Atrocities Act had been introduced to prosecute violence and discrimination by upper castes against two of India's most historically marginalized groups, Dalits, legally referred to as scheduled castes, and Adivasi indigenous groups, referred to as scheduled tribes. And so they went to their local police station in Jaipur to register a complaint under the Act and the Indian Penal Code, accusing Karishma's family of casteist hate speech, grievous hurt, and abetting Raghu's suicide. The family was very aware that the legal system was not itself free from caste discrimination and that victory in court would be almost impossible. But despite this, Auntie Ji always hoped, her eyes firmly fixed on a horizon of formal public justice for her son. As I would learn, the very act of believing and hoping in the transformative power of the Atrocities Act soon became a labor of resistance she performed daily. She pushed herself to hope for Raghu and for others like him. She hoped, she was convinced that the Atrocities Act was a special law for people like her. And she hoped for the future of the Dalit movement. The act of hoping and actively engaging with Raghu's case under the Act became a way to not only rewrite the end of Raghu's story, but to rewrite the politics of law from the bottom up. Auntie Ji never believed that she could eradicate the pain of Raghu's murder. She also didn't believe in a perfect legal system. But what she did believe was that it was her job, the job of people like her, to make the systems of justice that were available to Meghwals and other Dalit communities comparatively better by engaging the one piece of legislation that had been introduced to protect them. The above scene offers a first glance into the contested, normative, effective, and political landscape that have emerged around the Atrocities Act since it burst onto India's legal landscape over 3 decades ago. The Atrocities Act is the only law in India currently bearing the contours of hate crime legislation. According to legal scholar Gail Mason, hate crime laws, which have increasingly been introduced across the globe since the 1980s, punish violent expressions of prejudice. Hate crime laws typically try to combat these crimes in two ways. First, by enhancing punishments for existing criminal offenses when they are committed against members of protected groups. Second, by sometimes introducing new substantive special offenses to outlaw prejudicial language as well as physical and material misconduct rooted in prejudice. Just share my screen for a moment. Sorry, for some reason, it's not letting me do the slides and this at once. So this is a little bit annoying. Okay, anyway, I'll just keep reading. The Atrocities Act has followed a similar pattern. Although, as I mentioned, India's constitution banned the practice of untouchability in 1950, caste discrimination still continued in violent forms. The Atrocities Act, therefore, represents the first law to explicitly define all verbal, physical, political, ritual, and symbolic violence against Dalit and Adivasi indigenous groups as criminal offenses, as historian Anupama Rao points out in her book, The Caste Question. The Act created a new category of discrimination and untouchability-related crimes named atrocities, which, to be prosecuted under the Act, had to be committed against members of Dalit and Adivasi communities by someone not belonging to these groups. It also enhanced penalties for certain crimes under the Indian Penal Code of 1860, which obviously has now been replaced. Finally, the Act introduced penalties for public officials who displayed neglectful or biased behavior during atrocity investigations and trials, as well as witness protection and financial compensation guidelines. The current version of the Act, which is the result of amendments in 2015, 2018, and 2020, specifies over 20 discriminatory actions, which range from offenses against the person to property offenses and insults or hate speech. As B.S. Krishnan, former Special Commissioner for Scheduled Castes and Tribes and one of the original authors of the Atrocities Act, emphasized, the Act was unique in its socially transformative anti-discrimination agenda. It was intended to do more than punish, but to gradually transform a society violently divided along lines of caste and indigenous identity into one defined by the principles of equality, liberty, and non-discrimination that Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, the father of the Indian Constitution, who himself belonged to the Dalit community, had enshrined in the country's foundational legal framework. However, or perhaps precisely because of its rigor and socially transformative ambition, the Atrocities Act has always been a deeply polarizing law in India and a disappointment to many who have fought for caste equality. Today, over 30 years after its implementation, scholars have questioned the ability of the Act to generate fundamental social change. Data released by the National Dalit Movement for Justice in 2020 reveals that most cases registered under the Act never make it to court and few lead to conviction. According to the Crime in India report issued annually by India's National Crime Records Bureau, the average conviction rate under the Atrocities Act across all Indian states hovers at around 20%. In Rajasthan, the conviction rate came to 16% in 2016 when I began my fieldwork, and roughly 20% according to recent data. In 2018, anti-caste scholar Ananta Tunde argued that ingrained caste bias within police and judiciary have systematically dismantled the Atrocities Act through two central mechanisms. First, the disproportionate reliance of atrocity classifications and investigations on the police, and second, a systematic denial of caste as motive in attacks on Dalits at the court level. As most of you know, criminal complaints in India are registered by the police, who are responsible for noting the appropriate sections of the criminal code in a so-called First Information Report, or FIR. This lays the foundation for the subsequent police investigation. Following the investigation, the superior investigating officer has two options. He can either submit a charge sheet to the district court or issue an alternative form called a final report. While the submission of a charge sheet implies that the police investigation has found enough evidence for the matter to be prosecuted in the court, the final report essentially means that a complaint is unsubstantiated. According to Sabir Kora, the police's decision to file a final report and effectively close an investigation into a complaint is usually sparsely monitored and highly discretionary. It allows police officers to sideline cases that do not align with their own societal belief structures and represent what Kora calls a first line of injustice delivery. In 2017, I interviewed a high-ranking police official in the police commissionerate in Jaipur who spelled things out for me in a shockingly blunt manner. Listen, he said, I don't really take these atrocity complaints seriously most of the time. Really, none of us in the police do, because people always try to make things about caste, but most of the time they're not. It's just neighborhood drama. And, the Dalits and Adivasis, they abuse this law to get their way. So these cases are mostly false. We don't really fuss too much about these cases, and we don't give in to these Dalit demands. And without us, there's no investigation. Kora shows that the result of this police attitude has been that most atrocity complaints are not forwarded to the courts, but close with a final report that declare the complaint false. This has produced immense social backlash against the Atrocities Act, even at India's highest judicial level. In 2018, the Indian Supreme Court drew on police data, and its judgment in Dr. Subhash Kashinath Mahajan releases the state of Maharashtra to declare that the Atrocities Act had become a vehicle for fraud. The second issue that arises is one that is likely familiar to hate crime scholars not just in India, but across the world. Courts are often skeptical of casteist motivations behind attacks on Dalit. A judge at the Rajasthan High Court told me that he would only ever be willing to convict anyone under the Atrocities Act if there was clear verbal evidence that they had committed a crime because of the victim's caste status. Otherwise, he said, it's all just guesswork. However, as Ananta Dumde sarcastically pointed out in his 2018 commentary on the implementation of the Atrocities Act, unfortunately for most of us, perpetrators rarely cry out in the middle of attacking a Dalit that they're doing so because of his or her caste status. As a result of these dynamics, many scholars have concluded that the Atrocities Act is an unsuccessful law. According to Dag Erik Berg, it has even been converted into an instrument of upper caste power. And yet, most of these critiques have neglected to ask the most crucial questions. What would it actually really mean for the Atrocities Act to be successful? And even more importantly, to whose vision of success should hate crime laws like the Atrocities Act be accountable? Answering this question means exploring from below how survivors of caste atrocities, their families, their communities, define success within a legal landscape that is fundamentally stacked against them. What I found is that atrocity cases are a battlefield where different notions of legal success meet. Just quickly going to throw up the slide again, even though it's not letting me sort of go through all of this. Just to show you this fieldwork bit. So this is a sketch, this is a map, which is in the book about where I did my fieldwork. And so this is a map of Rajasthan when it had the districts at the time, and now the district map has changed now. But it kind of highlights that most of my fieldwork, ethnographic fieldwork, happened around Jhunjhunu and Sikar. Some of it was in Nagaur, Udaipur, and Bhilara, and obviously in Jaipur, but really the concentration, most of the cases that I discuss in the book are in this sort of northeastern Sikar, Jaipur, Jhunjhunu area. Between 2016 and 2018, I conducted 18 months of multi-sited ethnographic fieldwork on the social life of the Atrocities Act in Rajasthan. As a woman of German heritage who had grown up in rural Uttarakhand for much of her childhood, I had become acutely aware how caste biases were routinely communicated, circulated, and reproduced socially and institutionally. To understand these patterns and the policies that had been introduced to counter them, I joined the Indian Institute of Dalit Studies in Delhi as a researcher between 2012 and 2013, and later worked on the advocacy team for the National Campaign on Dalit Human Rights. It was there that I became interested in the Atrocities Act, and specifically the social life of the Act in Rajasthan, which consistently registered high rates of caste atrocities, but received comparatively little scholarly attention. In 2015, the year before I started my fieldwork, Rajasthan had registered the second highest number of atrocity cases against Dalits, a trend that was reaffirmed in recent data released by the NCRB. When I arrived in 2016, I thus aimed to understand how the communities protected under the Atrocities Act engaged with this unique law. What, I wondered, did actually a successful atrocity case look like in the eyes of the different experiential and legal stakeholders involved in the cases? Had the high hopes its authors had once placed in the Act really failed, as much as the low conviction rate suggests, or was there more to the story? To explore this, I adopted an ethnographic methodology that I refer to as atrocity tracking. So with the help of independent activists, of lawyers, of legal aid NGOs, I identified incidents of caste violence within local communities and then followed them over the course of 18 months. I watched as they became matters of family concern, as they were transformed into local political issues at panchayat meetings, and became the subject of fact-finding missions by local legal aid NGOs. Working closely with a group of Dalit women's activists, I then followed survivors, activists, and local politicians when they decided to file complaints under the Act at police stations, and then tracked the progress of these cases until they were either closed by the police with an FR, settled out of court in the form of so-called compromises, or forwarded to the special courts that had been designated for cases under the Atrocities Act. Now, just a note on my positionality. When I was doing this research and I was writing this book, it was never my goal and it was never my intention to write about or to even try and represent in any way caste violence as a category of immediate experience. I'm not positioned to speak to that, and this book isn't trying to do that. However, what the book and the research are trying to do is offer a different important perspective of someone whose past had granted her the privilege to trace how caste bias is discussed, resisted, and reproduced at all levels of India's legal system. As a young white woman who spoke Hindi with what some have called like a Gaonwali accent, because I lived sort of in a village area of Uttarakhand, but had also attended a well-expected educational institution, I inspired a certain confidence among police officers and judges. But I was also female, I was unmarried, I was young, and so upper caste legal professionals never perceived me as a threat and shared their very controversial opinions about the Atrocities Act very candidly a lot of the time, even though they knew that they were on the record and that this would potentially make it into, a book. But at the same time, my childhood in a remote village in Uttarakhand also allowed me to fit in quite comfortably with the families of atrocity survivors in rural Rajasthan. So to the Meghwal families whose stories are in this book, I worked with them, I lived with them for many months. And to them, I was a daughter whose worldview they instructed. And so what I wanted from this book was to illuminate how caste bias is often reproduced through law and through legal institutions, while really staying accountable at the end of the day to the lived truth of discrimination my Meghwal interlocutors and the Meghwal families I lived with had experienced. So I had two fieldwork bases. I alternatively lived with one Meghwal family in a village in Jhunjhunu and one in Jhunjhunu town in the Shekhawati region of Rajasthan. And I also had a room in Jaipur where I worked with the Center for Dalit Rights. I interviewed police, I interviewed judges at the High Court and at the local, the district and the special courts. And the other note to just make about this book is that because of scope and analytical precision, this book really doesn't trace atrocity complaints filed by Adivasi communities in Rajasthan, because I think questions also around indigeneity and indigenous rights, they're complicated in their own right and they deserve to be explored on their own terms. So overall, I traced the fate of 40 caste atrocities going back maximum 2 years, and most of these involved attacks against Meghwals by Jats or Rajputs, but mostly Jats in Shekhawati. So the reason the large number of caste atrocities against Meghwals is really a direct result of the historical caste relations in the region, which had been defined by very rigid feudal structures that where Rajputs originally had been positioned at the top of the caste and economic pyramid, as the landowning elite and rented land to so-called, to Jat and Gujar castes, who in turn employed Dalit communities as casual laborers. While obviously land reforms were introduced after independence, which intended to redistribute land among laboring castes, these land reforms actually largely excluded Dalit communities. And what happened in Shekhawati was that Jat specifically emerged as the sort of de facto landowning caste. And what Meghwal communities have done, and there's a lot more information about this in the book, is that they've sought upward mobility through education. And what you see is that as a section of Meghwals has gained economic and social capital because of this educational advancement, Jat and Rajput caste have become quite threatened. And the reaction to this status anxiety has often been a rise in targeted attacks against Meghwals. And that those attacks are really meant to send the message that, stay in your place. But the educational capital that Meghwals in that region have accumulated also means that they really aren't that willing to accept that violence. So when I was there, what I saw was that they were very much actively organizing, and there were community organizations that were founded by the Meghwal Sangharsh Samiti, whose aim was really specifically to help survivors of caste attacks file cases under the Atrocities Act and sort of strategize around these cases. And that targeted activity around the Act yields a really important insight, which stands at the heart of the book, which is that while previous analyses that have highlighted the toothless nature of the Atrocities Act within a legal system shaped by ingrained caste structures, they do paint an accurate picture, but they also paint an incomplete picture, because they tend to equate failure with a low conviction rate and assume that the success of a hate crime law like this is uniformly envisioned by all stakeholders. So in Rajasthan, atrocity survivors, activists, and Meghwal lawyers mobilized the Atrocities Act to gradually rewrite structures of caste hierarchy and sociopolitical power in institutionally often invisible ways, to produce imperceptible shifts almost in legal culture and legal truth regimes. And what they cultivated was a mode of what Lynette Chua and David Engel referred to as agency-focused legal consciousness. The idea that law, and in this case, a hate crime law specifically, is ultimately an instrument for the transformation of oppressive conditions. So walking alongside survivors as they became legal complainants, I realized that the success they sought under the Atrocities Act was both socially and institutionally transformative in ways that often transcended individual case outcomes. And so one person who has talked a lot about, who's done brilliant work on specifically the situation in Rajasthan around the Atrocities Act, and specifically about kind of the motivations behind some of this mobilization, is Bhavar Meghwanti. And so he basically pointed out that, Rajasthan's not a state that's really had like a large scale anti-caste movement like other areas. And what he was basically arguing that because of that, actually there has almost been like an NGO-based focus, so on the Atrocities Act, and sort of on seeking justice through the Atrocities Act in the state, where like more and more activists have either they have joined sort of NGOs, or they sort of work in varying degrees with NGOs and do capacity building and do all this work, because the Atrocities Act is one thing that can kind of, around which people have been able to organize in a more systematic way. So what the book argues is that Rajasthan, which is a state that has never had the large-scale mobilizations that have marked Dalit resistance in other parts of India, the Atrocities Act has emerged as what I call a site for the project of legal meliorism, which is aimed at the gradual transformation of discriminatory legal habits from below. And I understand that I'm kind of getting sort of to the end of my time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to skip the nice big section I had for you on where the Atrocities Act sits in international hate crime laws, and where it sits in terms of being a special law in India and being a hate crime law on the international stage, but also how it relates to debates about sort of atrocity crimes in international law. And maybe we can talk about that in the discussion. But what I'm just going to do now, I'm briefly going to explain to you what I mean by meliorism, and then go back to Auntie G at the end to kind of show how she puts some of this project of legal meliorism into practice. So the term meliorism was popularized by pragmatist philosopher John Dewey and refers to the belief that the specific social conditions which exist at one moment may be bettered through persistent targeted action. And key to this idea is the pragmatist philosophy, the notion in pragmatist philosophy that social conduct is built on habits, patterns of social behavior and thought that aren't always consciously reflected. So changing individual and institutional conduct and attitudes means the cultivation of new habits. Meliorism thus refers to the idea that hope for societal transformation lies in the systematic cultivation of progress-directed work and the creation of habit that will gradually shift the status quo. And John Dewey's philosophical ideas obviously can be directly linked to the history of India's anti-caste movement, as they strongly influenced the legal and theoretical work of Dr. B.R. Ambedkar. Ambedkar gained his PhD in economics from Columbia University, but during his studies, he also attended classes in sociology and philosophy. And one of the people who taught him was John Dewey, who Ambedkar once said was his favorite teacher. So in his famous 1936 speech, The Annihilation of Caste, Ambedkar argues that caste is actually a state of mind, an attitude or unreflected disposition rooted in Hindu notions of purity that give rise to routine actions among upper caste towards lower caste, which are casually oppressive or outright violent. And so for Ambedkar, the word habit really had quite a negative connotation in the Indian context as a mode of thoughtless, everyday casteist discrimination. And as philosopher Scott Stroud, who's also been on this in this series, I've just learned, argues, he hoped that Indian society could be reformed through the purposive disruption of violent and non-violent casteist habits and the cultivation of new societal and institutional habits. And as both an economist and a lawyer, Ambedkar thought that legislation was really a key way to do that. However, as Pratikshya Bakshi has pointed out, the transformative potential of measures like the Atrocities Act has always been flawed by the structural allegiance of India's legal system to upper caste worldviews. And so Bakshi argues that the Atrocities Act has been paralyzed by the same structures of power it aims to address. However, as we go back to Auntie G, what we see is that this state of paralysis, so to say, actually doesn't mark the end point of Meghwal engagement with the Atrocities Act in Rajasthan, and it doesn't fully signify its failure. Instead, it marks the starting point of a multifaceted and multi-scalar agenda of legal engagement, which aims to undercut casteist habits and attitudes within legal institutions, sensitize India's legal structure to the unique truth regimes that govern marginalized life worlds, and reduce the historical footprint of dominant caste, not just in the Atrocities Act, but on the structure of criminal law in general. Arguing that true legal success lies in the ability to gradually improve the conditions for the possibility of real legal recognition for Dalits, atrocity survivors, anti-caste activists, and legal aid NGOs in Rajasthan cultivated what some called umid ki aadatein, or habits of hope, in dialogue with the Atrocities Act. And these were persistent everyday acts of legal and social labor, which they hoped would one day slowly eat away at the casteist structure that held individual caste atrocity cases captive and undermined them. So to illustrate these varied strategies, I elaborate on a number of different cases in the book. I discuss how Meghwals and Rajasthan often distinguish between good and bad rajinamas, or out-of-court settlements or compromises, how they try to negotiate the best compromise, how caste associations and political parties use the act, and even how they sometimes strategically file cases that, can be considered false according to certain criteria, but actually very true according to different criteria, to highlight deeper truth of discrimination. However, now, for the purposes of this talk, I want to return to RTG. After Raghu's suicide, I experienced her grief most intimately. However, I also experienced her hope that the Atrocities Act, which she considered a special law for people like her, would allow her to rewrite the end of Raghu's story. Considering the monstrousness of Raghu's final day and the habitual institutional obstacles that are laid in the path of atrocity complainants, RTG's insistence on placing her hope in a law that had been described as a failure by many was really surprising to me. But RTG's hopefulness was neither a passive emotional state, nor was it driven by the idea that Raghu's tormentor would easily be convicted by a court. Instead, it was a consciously chosen mode of daily labor, based on the idea that the Atrocities Act was a tool to bring the processes of the legal system in line with the lived realities of caste discrimination. At its core, her hope was really pragmatic. She was convinced that even if the legal system could never be fully successful for those who lacked social and political capital, it could be made comparatively better, and that was her job to bring about. So RTG had contacts with the Center for Dalit Rights and with a number of other NGOs, and she was friends with many activists in Rajasthan's capital of Jaipur. And despite that, the initial trajectory of the case was disappointing, of Raghu's case was disappointing. It was dismissed by the Special Atrocity Court in Jaipur, and after an appeal, it was also later dismissed by the High Court in Rajasthan. Karishma's family eventually filed a counter case against RTG and Uncle Ji under the Dowry Prohibition Act of 1961. However, RTG's family always insisted that despite these disappointments, what they had to do was to make sure that there were no more Raghus in the future. And the text of the Atrocities Act, the physical booklet, the paper that outlined the offenses and the punishments itself, for them held deep symbolic power because it proved that violence of the kind perpetrated against Raghu was not something they should accept anymore. So RTG always said that the text helped her cultivate umid ki aadtein, or habits of hope, because engaging with the Atrocities Act would strengthen anti-caste resistance at a broad level by building new forms of sociality. So if you look at Mayur Suresh's book on the social life of the Anti-Terrorism Act, Mayur Suresh, he argues that legal technicalities can serve as a platform for terror accused to decode their experience and build new networks of knowledge sharing and sociality. And similarly, RTG saw the Atrocities Act as a vehicle to strengthen social bond across Rajasthan Dalit communities and to foster legal knowledge exchange. And that implied a three-pronged approach. First, the Atrocities Act had to become a way to move more Meghwal bodies, more Dalit bodies into legal spaces, which they had historically been sidelined in. Second, the Atrocities Act had to be used consistently to publicize institutional discrimination and police negligence, and also as a way, cases had to be used as a way to stage targeted andolans or protests in the aftermath of caste atrocities. And third, the Atrocities Act for RTG and this whole group of people she worked with across the Center for Dalit Rights and other institutions was a way of creating legal knowledge, of capacity building around law. So it was a way to familiarize survivors, families, communities with their rights, with the language of law and the logic of legal truth. So after Raghu's death, RTG adopted a number of habits. Every morning, she would scour the Rajasthan Patrika, the local Rajasthan newspaper, for news about caste atrocities, and then she would contact all the activists or, local figures she knew to get more details about the incidents. She would gather all this information, and then she'd take out her booklet of the Atrocities Act, which she always kept on her night table, and read through all of the offenses. And then with a pen and paper, she would try and match what she was reading in the newspapers and with the offenses. And then once a week, there was a big meeting at the Center for Dalit Rights where she and other advocates who worked for it, they would sit down and they would discuss cases and debate what sections should be matched, what sections made sense. They would engage in lots of fact-finding missions, and then they would travel across the state to basically advise survivors on how to file a case, if to file a case, what sections to push for, and also then, work with local Migwal associations. And then twice a week, RTG also volunteered at the Center for Dalit Rights to talk to women who had either themselves been survivors of caste and gender-based violence or lost family members. And she talked to them about Ragu and encouraged them to take part in monthly capacity building workshops. And so these capacity building workshops that the center staged around the Atrocities Act became another knowledge sharing platform where survivors and families, they would come and they would learn more about their legal entitlements, so to say. And then finally, and I don't talk about this so much in the book because this actually grew after I left, but RTG made a WhatsApp group with all the women she met, and with all the legal activists, aid activists from the center, which has hundreds of people in it now. And that WhatsApp group was used to exchange news about incidents, about cases. They would discuss the reputation of local police officers, the caste attitudes of local village councils. They would strategize when and how atrocity complaints should be registered, which activists should accompany survivors to what police station, when they should follow up. And they also shared information about, the judges at special atrocity courts and discussed what types of evidence, for example, they usually demanded to prove caste's motives. And all of these activities together are basically what I call a meliorist hope complex, a cluster of practices, attitudes, and imaginaries which give rise to belief that law can one day bring meaningful justice if the beneficiaries of hate crime laws persistently engage with them to transform the legal system from below. Mr. Nehru, the head of the Center for Dalit Rights, once explained it like this. In a place like Rajasthan, with a deep feudal history, there's always been a really weak anti-caste movement. And Dalits have been dependent on big Rajput landowners and now often still depend on agricultural labor, on Jat lands. And these dependencies have made it really difficult to mobilize. That's why there are so many atrocities. But now what we're doing is we're using the Atrocities Act to do capacity building, to share knowledge, to educate each other about the law. And that in itself is becoming a movement. So for Mr. Nehru and RTG and many others, the aim of the Atrocities Act was not just to deliver convictions, but to modify an entire structure of habitual prejudice, violence, and institutional neglect. Before conviction rates for atrocity cases could rise, the act had to help Dalits actually own and move through the legal system with more confidence. Bantu Megwal, a lawyer in Jhunjhunu who almost exclusively advises on atrocity cases, summarized this mission succinctly. Our legal system has been built by upper caste and doesn't really grasp what discrimination looks like. For example, police officers from upper caste and judges, they don't see casteism, they don't want to see casteism, and a lot of the time that's also because they think that discrimination happens in one moment. But that's not true. Discrimination builds over time. And so a lot of the time when there isn't a certain type of evidence, for example, an attacker screaming a caste slur while beating a Dalit, then they don't see it as caste discrimination because they're only looking at this one moment and they're ignoring all the other stories the victim tells from before that incident and the social context around that incident. That's why it's so important that Dalits take part in the law more. We have to keep filing and we have to keep fighting atrocity cases until we can stop casteism from being blindly enacted by police and courts. So when Bantu Megwal talks about this, about consistently filing atrocity cases and fighting them, what he's saying basically, he's making a really pragmatist statement about this Ambedkar ideal of resistance. He basically says that the text of the law and the habits and engagements with the law that are built around it basically have to be rooted in the meliorist belief that the conditions of justice for Dalits and other marginalized groups can be bettered through persistent action, and that gradually you can, I guess, shave off the edges of the casteist assumptions within the legal system. So I'm going to end it here because I'm way over time. But what I want to say is that in conclusion, the Atrocities Act, there's been a lot of socio-legal debates around what hate crime legislation how to get it to work. Like, how do you prove prejudicial mindsets in court? How does one predict the likelihood of bias crimes or hate crimes in certain settings? But what these debates have often neglected is to sort of think about what hate crimes law actually achieves socially and politically, and what new interpretations of law, of politics, and social equality they generate. And also, who gets the ultimate say in the interpretation of their aims. And I think that the social life of the Atrocities Act in Rajasthan suggests, probably rather controversially, that hate crime laws aren't immediately effective within legal institution. The initial success of this type of law may well lie in the projection screen it represents for new visions of equality, for new agencies and hopes. And it also may lie in the new socialities it generates. So in Rajasthan, the Atrocities Act has engendered a profound awareness among many Meghwal families and communities that they have a right to demand real structural change from a legal system that often replicates oppressive structures. Now, I don't have time to talk about this today, but this project of meliorism that I just touched on, it also has generated new modes of oppression and inequality. So this idea of decasting law from the ground up, which is also partially driven by women like Auntie G, who are very financially stable, who live in urban contexts, what I saw has also at times excluded other women's voices. And during my research, I repeatedly encountered Meghwal women who had survived caste and sexual violence, who really struggled with the attention that activists and netas and Meghwal politicians brought to their cases in this effort to fight till the end. Because yes, they understood this as an ideal of caste resistance, but often fighting these cases and the attention that brought on these women actually often further expose them to violence and often also silence their own voices. So evaluating the success of a law like the Atrocities Act can never be straightforward. And maybe we can stop here and I can let Ashna take over. Thank you very much.
Yeah, so Asna, you can.
Yeah, I'll keep it short. I'll just divide my comments into two parts. One is where I just talk about the book, my reflections about the book. And in the second part, I have a few questions for you. I have exactly 5 questions. So just to begin with, I think the book, what it does is it really foregrounds a counterintuitive conception of justice, about what success within the Atrocities Act can mean. And this comes out very well through this dialogue between Auntie G and Sonali, who's the activist, where they're debating about this conviction-based idea of justice versus what Auntie G calls as real justice for her son. What is this real justice that Auntie G is referring to? So that is what the book is essentially about, because it is challenging what is the kind of transformation that such a law can formally bring. Then, as caste is the central organizing principle of the Indian society, there are tools that are there to encourage active resistance, as Sandhya points out in her book. One is a constitution, and of course, I think the Atrocities Act comes a close second, even though it's a criminal legislation. And like Sandhya points out, Atrocities Act is a special law, but it's for unspecial or second-hand people, which are the Dalits of India. And for example, that comes through in what the police, one of the police officers in your book says that when an atrocity victim goes to file an FIR, to lodge their FIR, and the police officer said, "Oh, you've managed to make everything about caste in this FIR," right? And then that's how you sort of see the gap between how this law is a special law, but then how the people are actually not treated in any special way. So therefore, the PoA Act is a tool for legal meliorism, as Sandhya points out, that it's a tool for incremental and gradual development, improvement of societal oppression through human effort. The PoA Act is a transformative act, but it keeps undergoing dilution, like Derek Berg has pointed out in their book, and also Tel Tumre has written about, which Sandhya has already expanded on. The book attempts to show us how, when the object of the PoA Act is not getting fulfilled formally through court-based institutions, through the justice institutions that exist in our country, the book shows us how attempts are made to fulfill these objects informally. And these strategies go on to produce what Sandhya terms as new epistemologies of justice and habits of hope. So whereas the law is framed as a preventive act, the title of the Atrocities Act is, it uses Prevention of Atrocities Act in its title. Sandhya shows that it's an act of possibility through these stories. So, it's preventive act, but it's to look at its true nature, it's a possible act. And what are these possibilities that are being referred to? As something that Sandhya has already shown by way of these different stories of Auntie G and the other stories that are there in the book. The book talks about how atrocity survivors therefore resist judicial interpretations. Now, this also has to be seen in the context of what were the alternatives to this legislative model that were being debated when the Atrocities Act was being debated, or before the Atrocities Act was debated. One idea was, for example, to give guns to people in Dalit villages, untouchable villages. Another option was to set up secret investigative agencies. But those ideas, of course, did not come through. And the idea that our bureaucracies and politicians went with was this legislative model. But then we also see how this model has continued to fail in terms of formal realization of its objectives. In a court case, the court said that SC/ST groups have tolerated indignities till 1988, and then they couldn't tolerate it anymore, and in 1989 this law comes. So therefore it also draws attention to what is the significance of this act and how courts also have recognized the significance of this law. However, on the other hand, the courts have completely diluted the act. That's another story. The goals of the act are also not realizable because of lack of SC/ST lawyers, or just lack of lawyers invested in this law, and even lack of representation of SC/ST judges. And this can be placed in context of how Sandhya described how candidly upper caste judges and lawyers were revealing the controversial opinions to her. And some of those opinions are also there in the book if you read. But then what this goes to show is that what you see actually in this book is how the Dalits have a lack of trust in the system and the society, but there's at the same time a heightened trust in the letter of the law. For example, as one of the characters describes in the book, that this is as a document, this act is a thing of beauty. And this is reminiscent of Ambedkar's struggles with the society and his excessive reliance on the law. And when he sees, how the state is against the Dalits, the society is against the Dalits, but he kind of had hope in the law that the law will not be against the Dalits. And I make a reference to Mahat Satyagraha cases when I say this. Now, I'd like to, I'll start with my questions. So my first question is, I'd just like to draw your attention to a contradiction, which is a few cases that came about recently, where the judge upheld an out-of-court compromise under Article 142 of the Constitution, the power to do complete justice, an out-of-court compromise entered into by dominant castes in that village and the Dalits. And the judge said that, I will uphold this out-of-court compromise and not give a conviction because this is what will advance peace and harmony. Right. So I was just thinking, how should we understand the implications of formal judicial institutions legitimizing these informal processes within their conception of justice? What are the consequences when the informal converges with and is absorbed into the formal? The second question is that the Act in a limited way recognizes intersectionality. And though the judicial precedents have rejected this law, for example, in the Patan Jamalwali case, what we also see is how Muslim women, for example, are seeking a law that recognizes intersectional violence against them on lines of the Atrocities Act. So are Muslim groups broadly demanding hate crime legislation. And there is also growing demand for legislation to address caste-based discrimination at workplaces and education institutions by Dalit groups. Do you see the PoA Act as opening up these other possibilities. For example, the Persons with Disabilities Act, the disability law that is there in India, it had in its section 92, it has a section which imitates section 3 of section 3 of the Prevention of Atrocities Act, and talks about atrocities against persons with disabilities. So something like that. I mean, I just want your opinion on what are the limitations of this. How can this law travel to recognize other identities and atrocities against other identities? My third question relates to how you talk about the PO as a tool towards legal meliorism, but you also, when you're writing about Pinky's case, you highlight how it is also about realizing the immediate needs of the victim or the victim's family. So I don't know if there is a contradiction there, because legal meliorism points to how through incremental and gradual change you want to bring about a betterment of the society, versus how in Pinky's case the compromise was entered into in order to immediately sort of resolve the issue or get justice in that case, informal justice. My fourth question is related to what you say about hate crime as a process, that the hate crime is of a processual and cumulative character, that you can't really capture it in one word or in one instance, right? So if we understand hate crime not as a single act, but as a process, does the incapacity lie primarily with the legislature's failure to articulate this adequately in law, or with the wider constellation of institutions like courts, police, investigative agencies that work together in ways that convert the law, ultimately defeating its purpose? So how do we locate responsibility in the drafting of statutes, or in the interpretation, or in institutional cultures? My last question is related to Raghu's suicide. So where Auntie's husband categorizes it almost, as an institutional murder, he says that even though it was technically suicide, but it was murder because of the caste system. And I was just thinking about how when the Rohit Vemula movement happened, that was how his suicide was also articulated as an institutional murder. And that is the deeper truth, right, that we are talking about. So I just want to know, will it ever be possible for law to articulate institutional murder because of caste or institutional casteism? And do we move towards something like restorative justice techniques like truth and reconciliation commissions? Is that a better possibility as opposed to the inability of the law to capture this at all? And lastly, just to conclude, those are my 5 questions. And just to conclude, you spoke about counter cases and, basically how different identities are being leveraged against each other. And because Dowry Prohibition Act, SC/ST Atrocities Act, all of these acts are all criminal legislations, right? So what happens is that the process itself is the punishment. Once you have an FIR filed against you, the process becomes the punishment, unless of course you're resourceful and powerful. So there's this competition for justice in that sense. And, as by way of caution, I mean, the law still lags in addressing competing inequalities. So therefore, I mean, we should probably look at the framework of graded hierarchy that Ambedkar talks about and try and address this competition for justice through different identities, using different laws and filing counter cases against each other. Yeah, that's all. Thank you.
Can I respond to that? Is that all right?
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. First of all, thank you. Thank you. Brilliant questions. And just, thank you for reading it so carefully. And actually, you're very thoughtful response. So I'm going to go through these slightly out of order, because I actually think that there's a couple of your questions, the second and third one, that kind of go together. The question about Pinky, the question about intersectionality, and the question also about compromises and consequences. To me, these are, so you said, there seemed to be some contradiction. And I think just to start with, I need to say that I think one thing that I didn't have the space to really talk about, but which I hope really comes out clearly in the book, is that, yes, there is a broader project of legal meliorism, but at the end of the day, different stakeholders in these atrocities cases want to use this law in very different ways and have very different ideas of what it should bring and what kind of justice it should deliver. And a lot of the time, that is like these different perspectives are directly correlated with issues around like how badly, for example, are you affected by different types of intersectional violence, right? So I think if you think about the Pinky question, the contradiction between you know, justice in the immediate moment and then also justice for the broader society, I think the reason that case is the first case in the book is because it's a microcosm about the kind of challenges and consultations and honestly arguments and disagreements that were happening within, you know, this sort of Dalit resistance circle in Rajasthan around this act. Because on the one hand, there's this like was a kind of a dividing line a lot of the time between like human rights activists and then sort of these local like caste association netas, in terms of like the neta types often favoring compromises eventually because they were also concerned with voter base, and a lot of them maybe wanted to had political aspirations, but also they had ideas about, at the end of the day, restoring village harmony, which is, for example, something that Suryakant Bagmore like writes around really beautifully in terms of like that being a really problematic concept sometimes. But and then, you know, people like Sonali, people who worked for the Center for Dalit Rights, who were like, nay, we have to like do this till the end. Like, you don't compromise, you don't do anything. The moment you compromise, moment you sort of give up, what you're showing is that if there's enough pressure, if there's enough blackmail, if there's enough push against you, to tum chhod doge. Like you'll leave it. You will just give up, and then what will happen is when people drop cases, there will be more accusations of false cases. So no matter what you do, for the good of the movement, you have to fight till the end, even if you don't get the conviction. And so that's one radical position, which obviously it makes complete sense when you think about it as like sort of a macro idea. But in reality, when you look at people like Pinky, it's just not doable, right? And I think the Pinky case really illustrates, even within her family, like her mother is concerned. Her mother is like, oh, shadi, and how's she going to get married? And, you know, there's all of these this public case around gang rape and caste in her name, and what's that going to do to her life, and what further violence is that going to expose her to, what cost is that going to have in her life? And her father, who's like wanting this very meliorist overarching like public justice, right? So there's a question there about like, how does positionality in terms of caste and gender, in class and gender also come into like what type of success, like what type of justice you're seeking from this act. And I think I don't want to at all claim that this is all one coherent, everybody agrees we should engage in this legal meliorist project. I think to an extent everybody agrees, but the reality of people's lives is very different. And I think that's where the compromise thing, I think that was your second question about courts upholding, you know, sort of compromise between upper class. I think that's such an interesting question, because once again, I think this is, on the one hand, something that a lot of people would be very happy about and something other people would be appalled by, right? On the one hand, I think a lot of the survivors, a lot of the women in families, but also a lot of families who maybe, you know, were victimized by atrocities, who are maybe, they're not yet highly educated. They're very much still, you know, living in sort of a more agricultural life world. They kind of really, for them, the aim really often was the sort of achara jinama, the good compromise, rather than the court conviction, because that was realistic. We want to file this case. We want to kind of show that we have support. We bring in people from NGOs. We sort of have people who are like educated lawyers from the city who will come and they'll speak up on our behalf, and they'll go to the police station. We show that we have support and we have power, and that like, you know, caste atrocities are now not going to just completely go under the radar, and that will sort of get upper caste to not do that anymore. It'll get them to leave us alone, and probably get like the sort of, get a public apology, get compensation, but mainly just get them to leave us in peace. And for a lot of the activists I work with, that was like kamzor. That was like a weak view of the law, right? That was like, oh, how can you? And they should be fighting. And I understand that, but also I also understand the other side of saying, like, you don't have to live in this village. And I think the phrase that comes up more and more with people who do engage in compromises is, was always like, "Hame to is gaon mein rehna hai. We have to live in this village. We have to live in this village," and that's really, really upsetting, right? It's really kind of pessimistic on one hand, but there's also like a certain realism to it, to that more tactical resistance of like, let's use law in life rather than the broad vision of legal transformation. So in terms of like, what do I think? What are the consequences of this? I think I don't know what the consequences of it will be, to be honest. I think especially at a time where, as you say, the law has been so diluted, I think there's a real danger that like if that happens more and more and more, then there'll never actually be a real conviction because this is the easier route. And we don't want that. But I think I'm also very, very careful in the book not to judge anybody who engages in compromises. It's not my place. And there's very good reasons. And especially as a woman, having worked with a lot of like girls like Pinky, you know, I would probably do it if I were in that situation as well. So, and I think to your point about intersectionality, I think does the PoA kind of leave space for this? I think this is the thing. I think in terms of like what it lists as offenses and what it kind of counts as an atrocity, I think it does. But in terms of the actual legal process people have to go through, I think there's very little consideration how like the same legal process affects people with different intersectional identities very differently. And I think, yes, there's witness protections and all of these, but I think there isn't potentially enough thought about if you have a woman like Pinky who is, you know, on the one hand, it's gender-based violence and it's caste-based violence. You know, there's the incident, which is that sort of intersectional atrocity, but also the intersectional violence that she's experiencing continues throughout the legal process, right? In terms of the way other people view her case, and in terms of all of these discussions of the way police officers specifically engage with women like that. I think that was probably one of the most horrible things that I saw again and again in interviews with, especially younger women, where police officers said horrible things to them, you know, basically like, oh, but I'm sure you enjoyed it a little bit type stuff, when actually young women came forward with cases like that. And so it's not just about like writing down, oh yes, and also here's a particular atrocity against valid women and this is the punishment, but it's thinking about like, how do you really have to sensitize a whole legal machinery? What other sort of parts of the process do you have to really get into and sort of reframe training of officers, like, and, you know, rewrite sort of certain norms in order for that to even be a possibility. Then hate as process. Yeah, and I think so. This I think maybe ties nicely into your question, like, are we asking sort of too much of law? And I think in a way we are. I think that's the whole issue in a way with hate crime laws generally, like asking a law to grasp something as slippery and as cumulative as hate, as discrimination, as, you know, prejudice, is very, very, very difficult. I think the one thing that I would say, probably just pragmatically speaking, is that if this type of legislation, and this doesn't just apply to India, is meant to be kind of successful in delivering courtroom outcomes, that what the debate that really needs to happen is like, what counts as relevant context in these cases? Because I think a lot of the time what the people I was working with were experiencing is that, you know, police officers or even like sort of special court justices would be like, but this doesn't have anything to do with it. Why are you telling this story? Like, this story has nothing to do with it. So a lot of the time what the survivors would do, they would try to build context. They'd be like, 2015 this happened, and this family treats Dalits like this, and they treat their mazdoors this way, and they do all of these things. And they would give this big rich tapestry of context, and then the officer was recording the FIR, or often even like the sort of judge in the special court be like, get to the point, like, this is not the incident you're talking about. And I don't think that's their fault necessarily. They have a long docket of cases. They have a lot of things to do, but I think there has to be like like a very direct discussion of like, in cases that are trying to measure something that is cumulative, what should actually enter like a case file in terms of relevant context and what should be considered. I think that would be my point.
Yeah, so now I would like to request the participant, if you have any questions, then yeah, there is a questions in chat box. Should I read, or are you able to visible this? Okay. So if you have any questions, then you can raise your hand and ask directly, unless you can also text in chat box. I think there is. Yeah, so before taking questions, I had also some questions actually. So let me ask, then we can go through that way. Yeah, so basically, I have not yet read the complete book, so apology for that. I have only completed the introduction and some parts of the book. But when I was reading the book, I really enjoyed it. It's feels like a novel kind of things, the real story into a novel format, like reading some kind of literature. So when you are bringing this from the ground, actually, and talking about the very idea of hope, quote unquote, and also later on the hate crimes. So how do you look at these two category? Because sometimes we also look at these two category like hope and hate. These are the emotion. So how do you relate? Of course, in the book also there is many way reflecting the emotional tone of the emotional tone of the peoples that you were interviewing and engaging with. But how these two broader idea of hope and hate that locating into the category of crime and legal system?
That's such a good question. And I think the answer is that actually I don't think the book really discusses these two categories as emotions. I think hate or casteism in the book very much shows up as a structural form of entitlement, right? And I think maybe that comes up most of you. There's the I think it's the 6th chapter on the Dangavas massacre, where I think that comes out the clearest, where the type of the discourse, the upper caste discourse around these issues all is rooted in this feeling of like hate equals entitlement to not be asked to basically move or give space or give anything up. And I think there's this brilliant work by David Lal, right, who worked with all these, like he interviewed all of these basically caste atrocity perpetrators, and he has all these different categories that he came up with, where he's like, it's like a caste atrocity often is seen as self-defense or as like maintaining cultural order, or these kind of things which all have to do with like entitlement. And there's all these code words around culture or sanskar and public, and order and social order that come up. So I think in this case, like hate really is a form of entitlement, and that comes through in like if you see the literature on hate crimes, people like Barbara Perry, I actually have it here on the slide, which I wasn't able to show. She basically really defines hate in that way, where she says, she says hate crime is a mechanism of power and oppression intended to reaffirm hierarchies that characterize a given social order. So it's a way of reproducing broader ideologies and patterns of inequality. And so it's basically a way of like keeping people in their place, right? And people have thought about hate crimes very much as this idea of like it being a messenger crime. It's a violence of communication to make sure that people know where they should stay. And I think on the other hand, hope in this book is also not just an emotion, it's a labor of dissent, right? It's kind of I think everybody who is hoping, all of these umeed ki aadatein, is like aadat is something you have to get used to it, na? And so hope is almost like it's showing up at this, like, I'm just going to almost, even if the feeling isn't there, I'm going to just like do this work again and every day and a little bit, as not just because I think then everything will be fine, but because this is me showing that it can be different and it needs to be different. And so I'll just, so it's labor, it's hard work, it's a resistant type of labor. I think that's how I would say it.
Yeah, thank you. So if anyone questions, then you can raise your hand. Yeah, Vidya.
Am I audible, Ganesh? Yeah.
Yes,
Thank
yes,
you.
yes.
Thank you so much, Sandhya, and thank you, Asna, for this wonderful presentation and also very provocative discussion. I wanted to ask particularly about not in the context of Rajasthan, but in other, I mean, other North Indian states, the most of the atrocities, particularly caste atrocities, are driven by the not Brahmin and like so-called upper caste, but mostly the dominant OBCs. So did you also encounter such cases where the atrocities were not like done by and provocated by the upper caste like Rajput or Brahmin, but dominant caste like backward caste or something like that? And was there any sort of method of negotiation was different when it comes to the Brahmins, Rajput, or non-Brahmin or non-Rajput caste groups? And secondly, it's more about methodologically. I wanted to ask you, as you also mentioned that I think Bhavar Megwansi or like your interlocutor during your fieldwork also comes from the same community whom you studied, or they were different? Because often I mean I read especially ethnographic literature. There is a this romanticization of lot of incidents during the when they tell their stories or narratives. So, and as a researcher you struggle to find what's the real story, because when you talk to someone else they say no, this was the not this version of the story. But because your interlocutor also come from the same community whom we were studying, so what was your like sort of ethical challenge for you to find what's the actual truth, what was the real story? So that's like I wanted to ask you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, once again, great question. So actually, most of the cases in the book, so in a way, Raghu's story is kind of the outlier here. But in Shekhawati, and I think I touched on that just a little bit, but maybe because I was trying to cut things out, I kind of cut this out by accident. But in Shekhawati and Junjunu, actually, most of the caste atrocities are Jat Meghwal, right? So it's specifically, it's like, it's very Jat heavy. Jats very much own a lot of the land. So there's a brilliant article by Akhilala, who is who's actually also from Junjunu and was a very close interlocutor, who looks at kind of the different forms of capital in Shekhawati, and he, very much talks about, you've got the sort of like Marwari sort of business capital, but also you've got the sort of the Jat land capital. And so a lot of the Meghwal members in this Meghwal Sangharsh Samiti, they had this story that they would tell, that we had the peasant revolts. Now you had the Shekhawati peasant revolts, and us time we would fight with the Jats. At that time, we had this sort of like common resistance. And then kya hua that, finally then they got all the land and they benefited from the land reforms, and now they are the worst ones. Now they discriminate against us the worst. And there's a lot of obviously discussion around status anxiety there, because then what Meghwals did is Shekhawati is an area that actually has a lot of educational opportunities. It is an area that has a very high literacy rate, a lot of access to education. And so, specifically, I mean, generally Dalit communities, but specifically Meghwal communities very much went for that. So now you have this thing where actually often in the same village, you have Jats who have these massive, they own all the land. They have all this zameen. But then actually a lot of them aren't that. women are, but a lot of the men actually aren't that highly educated. But Meghwal men are highly educated. And there have been incidents where Meghwal families are maybe buying up they're buying up an area of shops, or they're doing these things, and then these atrocities, they really spiral. So actually that kind of status anxiety about wanting to keep Meghwals in their place while fearing that Jat capital is not really translating beyond land into other types of social status, that actually is the root cause of a lot of these atrocities, and those are the most of them. So actually I think I saw a couple of Rajput ones and then a couple of Brahmin ones, but Jat, Gujar also in some other areas were really the main ones. So absolutely, I completely agree with that. I don't know that. I think you're asking whether the approach around that is different. Maybe the way these incidents get discussed in the village or something. I'm not sure. I don't know that there is a massive difference. I do think that a lot of in terms of whether a case would even be filed, a lot of the time I think it actually had more to do with how well connected and how politically and economically powerful is the individual who did it, rather than maybe just the is it a Rajput, is it a Brahmin? I don't think that was necessarily it. But for example, one of the cases in the book, which actually does involve murder, the guy who is almost certainly did it has massive political connections, and people were literally I'm not going to say anything, next thing I say something and people will find my body in the fields. No, so I think there's that also. In terms of methodology, so yes, I think there's a very good point to make about romanticization. So I think this is where it was very helpful that I followed cases for such a long time, because people's story change, but you also get to talk to many different people in one case who all have different perspectives, and over time you get a bit of a sense. But initially what always happened is I'd hear about an incident, either it'd be through one of the women activists I worked with, or it'd be through CDR, or and I'd go and a fact-finding mission, or I was staying in this one village, so wahan pe there was also stuff happening. And initially, every time you would go for that first conversation, people would be like, oh, this is so out of the ordinary. This never happens in our village. This happens in this type of stuff doesn't happen in Junjunu. This happens in Jalore, it happens in Jodhpur, it happens in Jaisalmer. It doesn't happen here, And then that was always the party line, and that was always the initial party line. And then you'd go back, and then you would still keep talking with the family, and then maybe you'd accompany the family, and then over time be yeah, sometimes actually kabhi it does happen. And suddenly it'd be actually this one woman accused me of being a dayan and a witch and all of these. So over time you get these small things, but the initial story was always other places, even from Meghwals, even but not here. And then over time be no, actually also here. So I think methodologically speaking, a small number of cases from an ethnographic approach, small number of cases over a long time with a lot of different actors, and going back to the same place and the same family again and again and again, that was very helpful.
Yeah. So
Hello.
I think someone is.
Hello.
Yes,
I wanted to ask a question. Thank you, Professor Sandhya, for interesting talk. My question is related with, I have not gone through the book, but to the lecture through this presentation, I wanted to ask about is the violence, especially the happening in the region, it's because of the social mobility. Especially there is a many kind of, especially youth, in youth or individual from the Dalit community or the Adivasi community for aspiration of a job or education. Are there any pattern of the violence is happening against those who is aspiring for the social mobility? Uh, uh, but it's your take on this. Thank you.
Yeah, very good question. I think in a way, yes. I think definitely, I think social mobility, or what people perceive, it's not even off like what sort of the perpetrators perceive to be somebody from a Dalit community aspiring for more, whether that's educationally, whether that's in terms of land, whether that in terms of, I think that's often the trigger, right? So there's one case in the book which is actually which is basically just, there's a Jat family that once, basically there's a this is not a Megwal, this was, I think, Jatav community, but basically this Dalit man like has a very good plot of land. It's a small plot of land, but it's very fertile. And this Jat family basically wants this land, and they ask him to sell, and he says, no, this is for my children. And then that's when the violence starts. And basically there's a lot of undercurrents there about like, how dare he refuse to sell this? How dare he think that he is allowed to keep this to make his family rich in the future? So I think it's not like, I think what I would say is that it is definitely aspirations for social mobility, in the sense that, but not always aspirations for social mobility as directly expressed by the person who's attacked, right? It's just a lot of the time like dominant caste or upper caste very much perceiving the actions of this one person as going beyond their status, claiming something that they are not due. It's not due to them. That's definitely what tends to trigger it. And the problem with that is that, like, you know, if you take the Dangavas massacre, that was very explicit, right? There was this contest over, there was contestation about a plot of land, and the revenue court actually spoke in favor of the Megwal family, and then the Megwal family moved onto the plot, and the Jats were basically, how dare they? And they basically mowed down the whole plot and killed everybody in the process. So in that case, like, very obvious, right? You're claiming something, you're claiming a status, you're claiming ownership. But in other cases, I think it was more subtle, where really is just that anything, if we're going back to this idea of hate as a form of entitlement, then very much it's very hard to predict almost what somebody who thinks that they should be on a higher sort of social hierarchy position than somebody else will perceive as that person trying to take more than they should have. So I think that's what makes it so insidious, that it's not always even an overt claim or an overt resistance or an overt ambition. It's just that a lot of the time dominant caste thinks that you are trying to displace them, and so they're coming for you, if that makes any sense.
Yeah,
Yes, thank you.
So if anyone else do not have questions, then let's wind up the meeting.
Ganesh,
So,
there is a question hand raised by Gautam. Gautam, please go ahead.
Yes, sir. May I ask a question?
yeah. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Fuchs, for the discussion. I was looking at some of the things that I personally faced while trying to file FIRs regarding personal atrocities that I faced. But there is a resistance by the police when they sort of flatly refuse to file an FIR. One parallel that I can give is in the university that I study in, National Law School of India. Here, if any complaint regarding caste harassment is given to the say there's something called the Equal Opportunity Cell or the direct committee, which are internal committees, they sort of don't follow the formal process of initiating an inquiry into it. Instead, they sort of form a mediation panel and do it in an informal way, primarily because they don't want to have any record of this thing anywhere. In fact, I was inadvertently sent an email stating some of these things, that if process is followed, then it might lead to a record, and it should be shown in RTA replays and all those sort of things. So this is a very this also touches upon what our Professor Singh had asked earlier. So instead of a formal FIR filing mechanism or formal route of addressing these complaints, very often informal mechanisms are followed so that there are no records being left. In your experience, how much of this did you see in Rajasthan? Or probably if you can comment on the university process also, if that is a right process. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your question. I'm not sure that I'm qualified to comment on the university process of it all, but I think this problem of like the police won't file the FIR, or they're not going to, or they're trying to not even record the statement that, or the claims that specifically the survivor is making. I think that's like the key obstacle, right? And I think I would say that most of these sort of legal strategizing and legal labor happened before court. Like a lot of the discussions within families, activist discussions, like, you know, Sangharsh Samiti discussions, all of these things were all about how do we get this case registered in the first place, and how do we make sure that the police actually applies not just the right version of the act, because at that point it was 2016 to 2018, and then police officers were often still dealing with the old version of the act pre-amendment and not the new one. And but a lot of the time there were certain sections that police did add, and then certain sections that they refused to add. So for example, they would always add like casteist insult or something because it's so fuzzy, right? And because it's like it doesn't have like that strong of a punishment, and because it's, you know, unless it's like very, very clear, also it's a bit like wobbly to prove. So one of the main jobs actually of places like the Center for Dalit Rights was to literally go with people to police stations and like almost negotiate with police officers, like you have to do this section, not this section, this is not the right section, that is not the right section, and like almost like educate the police on like what offenses there actually are and what they actually mean. But also even police officers did know them, sort of push and push. And I remember this one case where we literally like did a big runaround, like the police had like refused to register this one FIR, and then it went like all the way back to like the ranks of the police, like these CDR, Center for Dalit Rights advocates, they were like running in circles for like 2 days, going to the superintendent, going then to the police commissioner, going to all of these sections to like complain about the fact that the police wasn't doing it, and like aap unko phone karo, call this and make them register this. So basically just like a lot of the work is really like getting the police to do it. And I know that like if the police refuse to do it, you have other avenues, but those take time and they take resources. So that's definitely like the most common theme across all of the field work was that issue. I think in terms of not keeping records, it's interesting. I've never heard it phrased like that, but if you look at specifically the police, one of the other reasons why kind of this almost like meliorist labor sort of that a lot of activists and NGO advocates that they perform is so important is because if you accept for a moment that a lot of the people who are subjected to caste atrocities, you know, in Rajasthan, particularly in rural areas, maybe they're not always literate, right? There are a lot of cases where like the FIR, like somebody thinks they filed a case, but the FIR actually tells a completely different story than what the person says they told the police. So there's definitely a tendency of the police to leave certain things out of the FIR, like, and then it makes it easier to apply sort of less punitive sections and things like that. So the kind of refusal to like kind of the negligence of like not including certain things was definitely a very common pattern. And the other pattern, and I think this is like the third chapter of the book really talks about this, that the police often had was, I like to call it like interpretive refusal, where they just would act like they weren't understanding what the survivor was saying. Oh, you're claiming this, but this doesn't make any sense. A lot of the time, once again, when you want to understand an incident of caste discrimination, there's a lot of context. There's a lot of like, maybe there's a local word that somebody uses, a certain dialect word or something that's a slur. And a lot of the time the police would just kind of act like they would refuse to understand. They would refuse to take the story that somebody was telling and really interpret it and translate it into, what does this mean in terms of this act? What does it mean in terms of an offense? And just kind of be like, oh, but that doesn't, nobody said I'm boycotting you. Nobody said this is a social boycott. So it's not a social boycott. And then, you know, people would be like, of course, nobody said I'm boycotting you. There's ways of boycotting somebody without announcing it that way. But then all of these things would not be in the FIR, and then the case would be thrown out. So I think there's definitely a way of like, just not even making sure that there isn't a record, just making sure that there isn't a story, right? That the story isn't there. And if the story isn't right, then you can't, like, the story is so different on paper from what the person is saying orally, then it gets very tricky in terms of making this into any kind of case.
Yeah. So I think now nobody has questions. Yeah, so thank you. On behalf of Speaking from Margin, I would like to thank Sandhya and Ashna for joining us and all the participants for this thought-provoking discussion. We really enjoyed this talk and also having new kind of knowledge in the, particularly in the context of law and caste, which we usually not that much discuss. But this is very recent phenomenon that caste and law is talking more on the public debates and academic discourse. So thank you for bringing this new kind of research into the academic discourse. So again, I would like to thanks all, and thanks to all the participants, those who joined us. Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much.